Picture yourself standing on the walls of Kiev on a chilly November morning in 1240. Below, you see an endless sea of people and horses stretching across the horizon. The sound of creaking wagons, the grunt of camels, and the neighing of horses fills the air. It's a chaotic din that drowns out everything else, making it impossible to hear the person next to you. This isn't some nightmare. This was the grim reality faced by the people of Kiev when the Mongol war machine arrived at their gates. But here's the question. Why did one of the most powerful cities in Europe at the time, with 50,000 residents, formidable walls, and centuries of military tradition, crumble in just 9 days? What transformed these nomadic horsemen from the Mongolian steppes into the most unstoppable military force the medieval world had ever seen? Before we dive into this story, let me know where you're watching this from and what time it is. I'd love to see how our community spans the globe. Now, let's rewind to 1237, the year when the fate of Kiev and all of Rus began to change. In 1237, Kiev and the larger Rus were not united under a single banner. Rather, it was a loose collection of independent principalities, each with its own ruler, army, and ambitions. These principalities often clashed with each other, and Kiev, once the heart of the Rus, was no longer the powerful center it once was. At this point, the eastern and southwestern regions of Rus were gaining more independence and strength. The cities of Vladimir Suzdal in the northeast and Gallic Volhynia in the southwest had started to overshadow Kiev. Struggles over the Kiev throne were constant, weakening the city's power and influence. By 1240, Kiev was ruled by Prince Danilo Romanovich of Gallic Volhynia, who, however, was far from the city in Hungary, desperately seeking allies against the Mongols. Left to defend the city was Vod Dytro, a loyal and skilled commander, but one with limited resources. This brings us to a critical point. Kiev didn't fall because of a lack of courage or military skill. It fell because it was isolated in a fragmented world. At that moment, Kiev was part of a fractured region, with no unified defense against a Mongol invasion. Meanwhile, the Mongol Empire, a fearsome force on the rise, was marching westward. Now, let's turn our attention to the Mongols. The Mongol Empire was the product of Genghis Khan's vision. In 1206, he unified the Mongol tribes and set them on a path of unprecedented conquest. By 1237, his grandson Badur Khan led an army into the heart of Rus. At this point, the Mongol Empire had already conquered northern China and Central Asia, and its attention was now focused on Europe. But the Mongol Empire was not just a brutal war machine. It was an advanced military force, built on discipline and innovative strategies that the world had never seen before. Badur Khan, who led the Mongol forces into Rus, commanded a force of approximately 130,000 men. What's surprising is that not all of them were ethnic Mongols. The Mongol army was a multi-ethnic force composed of Mongols, Turkic peoples, and other subjugated populations, all united under strict discipline. The real mastermind behind the campaign was Subutai, one of the greatest military tacticians of all time, yet one of the most overlooked figures in history. At 60 years old, Subutai had over 4 decades of battlefield experience, and his strategy was as ruthless as it was effective. Subutai didn't just win battles. He studied his enemies, analyzed their weaknesses, and struck with terrifying precision. His campaign against Rus was a masterclass in military strategy. The first major test of the Mongols came in December 1237, when they laid siege to Ryazan, a city in northeastern Rus. The princes of Ryazan refused to surrender, and when the Mongol envoy arrived with an ultimatum to give up 1/10 of their wealth, horses, and armor, they defiantly rejected it. Their response, "When we are all dead, everything will be yours." This act of defiance would become a fatal mistake. Ryazan sent messengers to Vladimir, the most powerful principality at the time, pleading for help. However, Grand Prince Yuri of Vladimir refused, thinking that if Ryazan fell, the Mongols might retreat. He was gravely mistaken. After 6 days of brutal fighting, Ryazan was completely destroyed. The city was leveled, and every inhabitant, from princes to peasants, was slaughtered. The destruction of Ryazan was a key part of the Mongol strategy. It was a psychological tactic designed to break the will of other cities by demonstrating the terrible consequences of resistance. After Ryazan, the Mongols advanced through Rus, destroying Moscow, which was then just a small settlement, and setting it ablaze. They then attacked Kolumna, where the Rus forces attempted to make a stand. Even though the Rus forces put up fierce resistance, the Mongols emerged victorious. By February 1238, they reached Vladimir, the capital of the most powerful principality in the region. Batu Khan laid siege to the city on February 4th, and just 3 days later, Vladimir fell. The royal family was wiped out in the flames, and Grand Prince Yuri, the man who had refused to assist Ryazan, was forced to flee. Yuri fled north and attempted to rally a new army, which he assembled along the Sit River. However, on March 4th, this new army was utterly defeated, marking the end of organized resistance in the region. The Mongol juggernaut had crushed everything in its path, and Kiev was next. After Grand Prince Yuri was killed in battle, Batu Khan did something that many other commanders would not have done. He divided his army into smaller units and launched simultaneous attacks on 14 cities. Rostov, Uglich, Yaroslavl, Kostroma, Kashin, Chatan, Gorodets, Galek, Paris, Laval, Zaleski, Yurv, Pskov, Dmitrov, Volodymyr, Kolomsk, Tver, and Torzhok. Think about that for a moment. While European armies usually focus on a single major target, the Mongols could coordinate several campaigns at once across a vast region. Their communication, logistics, and organization were far more advanced than anything Europe had at the time. Only one small town, Kelsilsk, ruled by a young prince, managed to hold out for 7 weeks. The Mongols were so enraged by this resistance that they called it the Evil City and spared no one. 2 years of rest and calculation followed. After their devastating campaign in the northeast, the Mongols did not march directly on Kiev. They paused for 2 years. Why? because they didn't act impulsively. They allowed their army to rest, replenish their forces, and most importantly, gathered intelligence. In 1238, they ravaged Crimea and pacified Mordovia. In the winter of 1239, they took Chernihiv and Pereyaslav. But these victories were not just about seizing land. They were a way to gather intelligence, capture skilled engineers, and take prisoners for future battles. This was how the Mongols grew stronger after every campaign, while their opponents grew weaker. And now, the ultimate target was clear. Kiev, the heart of Rus and the symbol of Eastern Slavic civilization. Before advancing on Kiev, Batu Khan sent an embassy led by his cousin Monk. Monk arrived at the city and was struck by the magnificence of Kiev, the golden domes of its churches, its massive walls, and the sprawling city across several hills. He offered Kiev a chance to surrender, submit to Mongol rule, pay tribute, and the city would be spared. This was not a generous offer, but a choice. The people of Kiev killed the Mongol envoys. In terms of honor, this was an act of bravery. But strategically, it was a fatal mistake. Under Mongol law, killing envoys was an unforgivable crime, and it meant there would be no more negotiations, only total destruction. Batu Khan was not a forgiving man. The Mongol army assembled outside the city gates. After eliminating the small Chernihiv forces, which were on their way to relieve Kiev, the Mongols gathered their full might. According to the chronicles of Rus, the scene was so overwhelming that the sound of creaking wagons, bellowing camels, trumpets, the neighing of horses, and the cries of people were so loud that no one could hear each other. The land was overflowing with Mongols. Imagine you are a soldier on Kiev's walls. You see a seemingly endless army, hear strange sounds, and witness massive machines being set up, siege towers, catapults, and weapons you can't even name. You know that every city between here and the Eastern Sea has already fallen. Kiev's defense was organized, but not hopeless. Vod Dytro, the commander in charge, was a skilled veteran soldier. He knew Kiev couldn't win in an open battle, but with strong walls and enough supplies, he could delay the Mongols until reinforcements arrived or until the winter forced them to retreat. This hope, however, was fragile. Dytro organized the defense in layers. The outer walls were the first line of defense. If they were breached, there were additional fortifications inside. And if that failed, civilians could retreat into fortified churches, especially the Church of the Tides, one of the largest stone buildings of the time. This was the best plan he could devise, given the situation. But Dytro was up against Subutai, a man who had destroyed even stronger fortresses than Kiev's. Days 1 to 3, breaking the outer wall. On November 28th, the Mongols began their assault. They didn't attack from all sides at once, which would have been wasteful. Subutai chose one point to focus his efforts, the Lead Sky Gate in the south. The nearby forest provided cover for the attackers from arrows fired from above the wall. The Mongols positioned not just a few catapults, but dozens of them. They had learned siege warfare from the Chinese and Persians and applied it mercilessly. Day and night, massive boulders rained down on the walls, producing a sound described in the chronicles as continuous thunder. The defenders could neither sleep nor rest. The psychological pressure was unbearable, but the worst was yet to come. The Mongols didn't only use stones. They also hurled molten metal, a tactic they had learned from Chinese engineers. Imagine the agony of soldiers on the walls as drops of burning metal fell on them. There was no way to dodge or treat the wounds. After 3 days of relentless bombardment, a section of the wall finally collapsed. Days 4 to 6, street fighting. The Mongols poured into the Yaroslavl district, one of the inner areas of the city. Despite the chaos, Kiev didn't surrender. The defenders fought fiercely, determined to hold out for as long as possible, but the city was weakening with every passing day. As the battle continued, the people of Kiev retreated, fighting from house to house. Dmytro and his soldiers organized counterattacks. But this is where we see another crucial aspect of Mongol strategy: patience. Rather than attempting to capture the entire city in one brutal push, Batu Khan ordered a halt to the fighting, allowing his troops to rest. This may sound like a humane approach, but it was actually a cruel tactic. While Mongol soldiers rested, the people of Kiev had to remain on high alert 24/7, never knowing when the assault would resume. The tension, fear, and exhaustion mounted, and the people began building new fortifications around Stroke Hill, surrounding the Church of the Tides. This would become their final line of defense. Days 7 to 9, the collapse. After observing weaknesses in the new defenses, the Mongols attacked once more, this time with even greater intensity. According to the chronicles, the sound of crashing lances and clattering shields could be heard all over the city. The sky was obscured by a storm of arrows, and the ground was littered with the dead. Blood flowed like water in the streets. Void Dmytro, severely wounded, fought on, but many of Kiev's elite warriors were killed in the onslaught. The defenders were eventually overwhelmed as the Mongols climbed over the walls. Despite the exhaustion, the Mongols stayed through the night. During that time, the people of Kiev built additional fortifications around the Church of the Tides. Thousands crowded into the church, women, children, the elderly, all seeking refuge and bringing whatever they could save. The next morning, the Mongols launched their final assault. It was a massacre. The people of Kiev fought to the last man and woman. So many packed into the church that the balcony collapsed under the weight, crushing those below. The Mongols finally took Kiev on December 6, 1240, the feast day of St. Nicholas. Now, we know what happened, but the more important question is why. Why were the Mongols able to achieve what no one else could? Let's break down the key factors. Merit-based system, not bloodline unlike European and Rus armies, where leadership was often determined by bloodline. The Mongols promoted leaders based on ability. If a commander failed, they were replaced immediately. If they succeeded, they were promoted regardless of their background. Subutai, the mastermind behind this campaign, was not nobility. He was the son of a blacksmith, but Genghis Khan recognized his military genius and gave him absolute authority on the battlefield. This system created a meritocratic leadership class, producing commanders far superior to any opponent in Europe. Decimal military organization: Genghis Khan organized his army into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 men, each with its own commander and clear responsibilities. While this may sound simple, it was revolutionary. This structure allowed the Mongols to execute complex campaigns with precision. A European army might take hours to organize and move, while the Mongols could chain formations in minutes. This system also broke down tribal loyalties. A unit of 10,000 would include soldiers from many different tribes, all loyal to their commander and to the Khan, not their old tribe. Superior communication systems: the Mongols established a relay station network called YAM. These stations were spaced 40 to 50 kilometers apart, each with fresh horses and messengers ready to carry messages. This system enabled messages to travel hundreds of kilometers in a single day, a speed unmatched by any other army. It allowed commanders like Subutai to coordinate multiple campaigns over vast distances, adapt quickly, and strike at several targets simultaneously. For instance, in 1241, one Mongol army defeated Poland on April 9th, while another, led by Batu Khan, conquered Hungary 2 days later. Intelligence and espionage before launching any campaign. The Mongols spent months, sometimes years, gathering intelligence. They used merchants, defectors, prisoners, and spies. By the time Batu Khan reached Rus, he already knew everything about the competing principalities, the strongest fortifications, the best routes for winter, and the key political players. This was not luck. It was a result of meticulous intelligence work over several years. Ability to learn and adapt, perhaps the most critical factor in Mongol success, was their ability to learn and adapt. The Mongols came from the steppes, where they had little experience with siege warfare. However, when they encountered walled cities in China, they did not try to impose their traditional methods. Instead, they learned. They captured Chinese and Persian engineers, incorporating their skills into the Mongol army. These engineers traveled with the Mongols, designing and building siege equipment wherever needed. Catapults, siege towers, tunneling techniques. These were all adapted from their enemies and perfected by the Mongols. By the time they reached Kiev, they had over 3 years of experience in breaking through fortified cities, and they were masters at it. Systematic psychological warfare. The Mongols used psychological warfare as a weapon of war. They would destroy cities ruthlessly, leaving behind survivors with tales of horror to spread. This tactic instilled fear in enemy cities, often leading them to surrender without a fight. The destruction of Ryazan, for example, sent a clear message to the other Rus cities. By the time the Mongols reached Kiev, the psychological effect of their previous victories had already weakened the resolve of many defenders. The Mongols deliberately cultivated a reputation for brutality, but this was not purposeless savagery. It was a calculated strategic tool. Their method was simple. If a city surrendered without a fight, its people would live and only have to pay tribute. If a city resisted but eventually surrendered, some of its people were killed to set an example. But if a city resisted to the end, everyone would be massacred. The stories of Ryazan, Vladimir, and other cities spread quickly, and when the Mongols arrived at a new city, its inhabitants already knew the fate of those who had resisted. Many cities chose to surrender without a fight. Kiev, however, chose the other path and paid the price. 7. Ruthless use of prisoners. One of the darkest tactics employed by the Mongols was using prisoners from previously conquered cities as human shields in future sieges. Often civilians, these prisoners were forced to march ahead of Mongol troops when attacking city walls. They endured arrows and boiling oil fired by defenders, who were sometimes shooting at their own people. This tactic had multiple purposes. It protected Mongol soldiers from initial casualties, created a moral crisis for defenders, and preserved Mongol troops for the critical stages of the assault. It was cruel but effective. Humanitarian catastrophe. When the Mongols finally took Kiev, they systematically looted the city. Of its 50,000 inhabitants, only about 2,000 survived. Most of the city was burned, and of the 40 major buildings, only 6 remained standing. 6 years later, in 1246, Giovanni de Pien del Carpine, a papal emissary, passed through Kiev. He wrote, "When we were journeying through that land, we came across countless skulls and bones of dead men lying on the ground." Interestingly, Void Daitro, the commander of Kiev's defense, was captured alive, and Batu Khan did not kill him. According to chronicles, Batu ordered that Daitro's wounds be tended to, respecting his bravery. This is a lesser-known aspect of Mongol rule. While they were ruthless with those who resisted, they respected true courage. Daitro had fought valiantly, and Batu acknowledged that, Galicia Volhynia's submission after destroying Kiev, the Mongols turned their attention to Galicia Volhynia. Their goal was to conquer Prince Danilo, who had fiercely resisted them. Some cities, such as Kremenets and Kholm, successfully held out. Their strong walls were too much for Batu Khan to waste time on. He needed to advance westward to attack Hungary and Poland before news of his army's arrival allowed those regions to fully prepare. Eventually, in 1245, Danilo traveled to Sarai, the new capital of the Golden Horde on the Volga River, to meet Batu Khan and formally submit. According to the chronicles, Danilo spent 25 days at the Horde. What's notable about the negotiations is the outcome. Galicia Volhynia didn't have to pay monetary tribute, only provide troops when the Mongols demanded them. This shows that the Mongols were more flexible than they're often given credit for. They didn't want to destroy everything. They wanted control. If a prince could serve as a useful vassal, they would allow him to live and continue ruling. The conquest of Europe and the mysterious withdrawal in 1241, the Mongols advanced into Central Europe with 3 armies. One defeated Poland at Legnica on April 9th, while another led by Batu Khan crushed Hungary at Mohi on April 11th. A smaller force attacked the Balkans. Europe panicked. No army could stop the Mongols. The road to Vienna, Rome, and Paris lay open. But then, the Mongols suddenly withdrew. This was not because they were defeated, nor because they lacked resources, but because, in December 1241, news arrived that Great Khan Ogidi had died. Under Mongol law, all princes had to return to Mongolia to participate in the Kurultai, the assembly to choose the next Khan. Batu Khan, a potential candidate for the throne, had to leave, and with his departure, the opportunity to conquer the rest of Europe vanished. This remains one of history's greatest what-ifs. If Ogidi had lived just a few more years, European history could have been radically different. Long-term legacy: the Mongol invasion left a profound legacy on Eastern Europe. 1. The fragmentation of the Eastern Slavs. Many historians believe the Mongol invasion was the primary reason for the division of the Eastern Slavs into 3 separate nations: Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Before the Mongols, the Slavic people had been united under Kievan Rus. But after the invasion, different regions developed along different paths. 2. The rise of Muscovy as Kiev weakened. Moscow, which had been a small town, began to grow. Moscow's princes learned to cooperate with the Mongols, collecting taxes for them and gradually accumulating power. Many aspects of the later Russian Empire, including the postal system, military organization, and the concept of autocratic centralization, were inherited from the Mongols. 3. The East-West gap. Some historians argue that the Mongol invasion created a 200-year delay in the economic, social, and scientific development of Russia compared to Western Europe. While Western Europe experienced a renaissance, Eastern Europe struggled under the burden of the Golden Horde. Resources were drained through heavy taxation, and many crafts were lost or disrupted. The Mongols deliberately cultivated a reputation for brutality. But this was not senseless violence. It was a calculated strategic tool. Their method was simple. If a city surrendered without resistance, its people would live and only have to pay tribute. If a city resisted but eventually surrendered, some inhabitants would be killed to make an example. But if a city fought to the end, everyone would be massacred. The stories of Ryazan, Vladimir, and other cities spread quickly, and by the time the Mongols reached a new city, its people already knew what fate awaited those who resisted. Many places chose surrender without a fight. Kiev, however, chose defiance and paid the price. 7. Ruthless use of prisoners. One of the darkest tactics of the Mongols was their use of prisoners from previously conquered cities as human shields. These prisoners, often civilians, were forced to go ahead of Mongol troops when attacking city walls. They had to endure arrows and boiling oil fired from defenders, who often unknowingly shot at their own people. This tactic served several purposes. It protected Mongol soldiers from initial casualties, created a moral dilemma for the defenders, and preserved Mongol forces for the critical stages of the siege. It was cruel but highly effective. Humanitarian catastrophe. When the Mongols captured Kiev, they systematically looted the city. Of the 50,000 inhabitants, only about 2,000 survived. Most of the city was burned, and of the 40 major buildings, only 6 remained standing. 6 years later, in 1246, Giovanni de Pien del Carpine, a papal emissary, passed through Kiev and noted, "When we journeyed through that land, we came across countless skulls and bones of dead men scattered on the ground." Interestingly, Void Daitro, the commander of Kiev's defense, was captured alive, but Batu Khan did not kill him. Instead, Batu ordered his men to care for Daitro's wounds, recognizing his bravery. This reflects a lesser-known aspect of Mongol strategy. While they were ruthless with those who resisted, they respected genuine courage. Dietro had fought fiercely, and Batu acknowledged that. Galicia Volhynia's submission after taking Kiev, the Mongols focused on Galicia Volhynia, aiming to conquer Prince Danilo, who had fiercely resisted them. Some cities, such as Kremenets and Kholm, successfully held out due to their strong walls, but Batu decided they weren't worth wasting time on. He needed to move westward to attack Hungary and Poland before the news of his army's approach allowed those regions to fully prepare. In 1245, Danilo had no choice but to travel to Sarai, the new capital of the Golden Horde on the Volga River, to meet Batu and formally submit. Danilo spent 25 days at the Horde. The result of their negotiations was interesting. Galicia Volhynia didn't have to pay tribute, but only had to provide troops when required. This shows that the Mongols were more flexible than often assumed. They didn't want to destroy everything. They sought control. If a prince could serve as a useful vassal, they allowed him to live and continue ruling. The conquest of Europe and the mysterious withdrawal in 1241, the Mongols advanced into Central Europe with 3 armies. One defeated Poland at Legnica on April 9th, while another led by Batu crushed Hungary at Mohi on April 11th. A smaller force attacked the Balkans. Europe panicked. No army could stop the Mongols. The road to Vienna, Rome, and Paris lay open. But then, the Mongols suddenly withdrew. This was not because they were defeated, nor because they lacked resources, but because, in December 1241, news arrived that Great Khan Ogidi had died. Under Mongol law, all princes had to return to Mongolia to participate in the Kurultai, the assembly to choose the next Khan. Batu, a potential candidate for the throne, had to leave. With his departure, the opportunity to conquer the rest of Europe vanished. This remains one of history's greatest what-ifs. If Ogidi had lived longer, European history might have been entirely different. Long-term legacy: the Mongol invasion left a profound legacy in Eastern Europe. Fragmentation of Eastern Slavs. Many historians believe the Mongol invasion was a key factor in the fragmentation of the Eastern Slavs into 3 separate nations: Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Before the invasion, they were united under Kievan Rus. Afterward, different regions developed along separate paths. The rise of Muscovy as Kiev weakened, Moscow, then just a small town, began to grow. Moscow's princes learned to work with the Mongols, collecting taxes for them and gradually accumulating power. Many aspects of the later Russian Empire, from its postal system to its military organization and centralization of power, were inherited from the Golden Horde. The East-West gap: some historians argue that the Mongol invasion delayed the economic, social, and scientific development of Russia by about 200 years compared to Western Europe. While Western Europe experienced the Renaissance, Eastern Europe bore the burden of the Golden Horde. Resources were drained through heavy taxation, and many crafts were lost or disrupted. Lessons from the Mongol conquest. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Mongol invasion is the lesson it teaches us about modern warfare. The Mongols demonstrated that organization and discipline can overcome sheer numbers. Fast communication is a strategic advantage. Adaptability trumps tradition. Intelligence determines victory before the first battle is fought. These principles are still relevant today. Lesson 1. Fragmentation is a fatal weakness. Kiev didn't fall due to a lack of courage, but because it stood alone. The Slavic principalities couldn't set aside internal rivalries to face a common threat. Ryazan called on Vladimir for help, but was refused. Vladimir fought alone and lost. Kiev sought allies in Hungary and Poland, but too late. In today's world, where global challenges like climate change, pandemics, and technological threats demand cooperation, the lesson about working together remains crucial. Lesson 2. Innovation beats tradition. Kiev had centuries of military tradition, but the Mongols brought a completely new approach. They were not bound by tradition. They learned, adapted, and innovated. In today's business and technology world, companies and nations that cling to outdated models are often disrupted by more flexible and innovative competitors. Lesson 3. Information is power. The Mongols spent years gathering intelligence before attacking. They knew their enemies better than the enemies knew themselves. In today's connected world, the ability to gather, analyze, and act on information faster than your competitors is a decisive advantage. Lesson 4. Merit must be rewarded. The Mongols' merit-based system, where leaders were chosen based on ability rather than bloodline, was a key reason for their success. Organizations today must ask whether they're promoting the right people or letting politics and family ties determine leadership. Lesson 5. The brutality of war. Finally, the story of Kiev reminds us of the horrific cost of war. 50,000 people reduced to 2,000, families torn apart, cultural heritage destroyed, and children orphaned. There's no real glory in war, only survival or destruction. In a world still full of conflict, remembering these lessons can help us strive for peace and resolve differences without violence.